let's go. So, hello everybody, my name is Sandrine Salerno. I'm really happy to meet you this afternoon for the first Gender Lens webinar that SFG is doing. A warm welcome to our speakers. I will let Tim Raji, which is the chairman of this initiative, introduce our speakers. Maybe before giving a few words on SFG, the rule of this webinar, except the speaker who will speak and that we want to listen, you have to turn your mic off and your camera also. And if you have question or comment, you use the functionality of the chat, and the team will choose at the end of the different speeches which question will be answered. So as I told you before, I represent SFG. I'm the director of SFG. My name is Sandrine Salerno. SFG is a non-profit association, and Tim Raji is one of our vice presidents. And thank you, Tim, for the initiative, and thank you, Tim, also for this afternoon. The goals of SFG, very simple. It's to drive the debate on sustainable finance. It's to make sustainable finance the new normal. And we have a website, we have a newsletter, and at the end of this year, we will run with many partners a great event, a big conference, Swiss conference on sustainable finance, second edition, and the name of this conference is Building Bridges. So I hope that if you don't know SFG, you will visit our website, you will subscribe at our newsletter, and you will join us in this big initiative on sustainable finance called Building Bridges. Now I'm going to let the floor to Tim Raji, Vice President of SFG, who will introduce our speaker, and many, many thanks to all of them to be with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Sandrine. That's a great introduction, and we're all very proud to be part of the Sustainable Finance Geneva movement because the association has been such a pioneer for sustainable finance for the last dozen years now in Geneva and Switzerland. So today is, because it's the first webinar for the Gender Lens investing on the Gender Lens investing topic and for the Gliss, the Gender Lens initiative for Switzerland, we thought that it would be helpful to all those who are participating to get a diversity of perspectives on what Gender Lens is today. What are the standards of industry? What are the initiatives? What are some of the investment solutions? How do you intervene in Gender Lens if through donations and technical assistance? So really the idea of this webinar is to give you a very quick perspective on a lot of different dimensions, but because of the time constraints, we will not be able to go too deep in each subject, and you're invited to either contact Sustainable Finance Geneva or each of the speakers at your discretion after this webinar if you want to deepen your knowledge in any of the topics that we have. We're very fortunate to have a stellar group of speakers for this first webinar. My thanks to everyone for making yourselves available. We have, of course, Jessica Espinoza, who's based in Germany, works for the German Development Agency, and has been really a motor for change with regards to Gender Lens, both at her agency and on the international scene, especially in the DFI ecosystem. Jessica is also a member of the Gliss Academic Research Committee, and she's doing her PhD on the topic. So my thanks, Jessica, for joining us today as an expert speaker. We also have Emmeline Liu, who very kindly joins us from the US. We appreciate the early rise, Emmeline, to join us. Emmeline is working with Calvert Impact Capital, which is one of the leading impact investors in the world. And in particular, Emmeline, as its general counsel, has contributed to a recent report that they produced on the legal definitions for Gender Lens investing. And she'll be sharing the insights of that report with us today. My thanks, Emmeline, for being with us. We also have Christine Rhodey, who's based also in Washington, D.C., who's heading the Alpha Mundi Foundation and who has been an innovative force in philanthropy through the G-Search program, which uses donations for technical assistance among small and medium enterprises to help develop a gender lens approach in these companies. Finally, the last two speakers, but not the least, we have David Ozaki from the IISD. He's a sustainable finance expert and a senior advisor there, and he's also a member of the Investment Solutions Committee of the Gliss. So a lot of expertise on financial products and the broader trends in the financial industry on gender lens. And of course, Vanina Farber, who is the ELEA chair for social innovation at the IMD. She is a well-known academic authority on impact and on sustainable finance, and we are very grateful for her participation in the academic research committee of the Gliss and for her contributions to the research that we're developing now for the Swiss market. Thank you, Vanina. I will begin perhaps with a very quick overview of what is the status quo of gender lens investing today, mostly from a global perspective, so that we can also understand the interventions of each of the speakers in this broader framework. If we can go to the next slide. Essentially, what we're talking about here is Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which aims to achieve gender equality and to empower women and girls worldwide. We know, of course, that we're far yet from that target. You can see here some of the statistics related to women in poverty, the legal rights of women, women affected by gender-based violence, and of course the gap. Now, this projection of 99.5 years to close the gender gap is a figure that was designed mostly by the World Economic Forum, I believe, before COVID, and since then it's gotten worse, right? COVID had a disproportionate effect on women's economic empowerment. So all of this would speak normally to a much bigger effort in terms of mobilizing capital for the Sustainable Development Goal number 5. But in fact, SDG 5 is actually the most underfinanced goal so far, and yet it's one of the most far-reaching. Recently, there was an intervention by Donna Bertarelli, who's a leading philanthropist of Switzerland, at an UNCTAD conference, and she made the point that if we finance SDG 5 and if we achieve gender equality, in fact, we are enabling so many other of the sustainable development goals, from climate change to poverty to sustainable food and health, of course. Next slide, please. Now, here we have a bit more insights on the COVID-19 impact. A lot of the jobs that were lost by women, much more so than by men. Women also represent a much greater share of the workforce in the health sector. And of course, as frontline workers in the crisis, they were particularly affected. And we've also seen that women-led firms were strongly affected by the pandemic, much more so than men. And that's in part because of an unequal access to opportunities for women, in particular, access to capital. Now, we like to think at Gliss and at Sustainable Finance Geneva that we can bank on women leadership for the sustainable transition to a more equal society and a more sustainable economy. We have leadership in the political arena. This is one example. We saw the performance of Jacinda Ardern during COVID-19. New Zealand is still one of the best performing countries when it comes to crisis mitigation and management. Next slide. We have another example of women leadership here in the person of Geeta Gopinath, who was the first chief economist woman of the IMF, appointed by Christine Lagarde. And obviously, since then, the IMF has, hold true to its reputation when it comes to providing a stabilizing force for the world in times of crisis. And one last example, of course, there are dozens of examples, but the next slide, we can see that we also aspire to leadership of women in the financial industry. And it is incredible to see that it took until September 2020 for one of the world's major banks to announce a woman as its CEO, right? The first among major banks. Now that bodes well for the change that we want to see, right? That we have already a lot of examples from different arenas of women leadership and how women leadership can contribute to a better world. And one of the purposes of the Gliss is, of course, to help achieve that in Switzerland as well. Next slide, please. In the financial industry, which is such a key sector for Switzerland, these, by the way, are statistics mostly from the US market, because it's one of the few markets to actually have data on that front. But I don't expect that the data would be any better in other developed economies or other financial industries. We can see that the share of financing that goes to women, that have businesses is very low, and that the share of representation of women in the different segments of the financial industry, whether it's private equity, venture capital, or hedge funds, in senior roles, right, in leadership roles, is in fact incredibly weak, especially considering that now women are receiving the majority of college degrees in the US, right? We also know of the glass ceiling in terms of women representing roughly 46% of staff, but only 15% of senior leadership. And in fact, recently in Switzerland, a law was passed asking companies to assess the gender gap and giving companies a couple of years to report on that gender gap, but that law does not have any penalties or consequences if companies fail to do so for now. So that's just one example of how much work we still need to do. In Switzerland, of course, at a principle level, equality between men and women is enshrined in the federal constitution. It is a key part of the Swiss foreign policy, but unfortunately we are still slipping in terms of rankings, world rankings, on the gender gap report from the World Economic Forum in the last 5 years. And we know that women still earn roughly 20% less than men for an equal job. So still some work to be done there. Next slide, please. So what is Gender Lens Investing? If you received the invitation to this webinar, that was in the invitation itself. Basically, it's about women-owned or women-run businesses. It is about the equity in the workforce between men and women in businesses. It's about gender-inclusive value chains. It's about designing products and services with women and girls in mind as consumers. Perhaps even involving women and girls in the design of these products and services, and finally making sure that your business operations do no harm to the women in the communities that you operate. Now, Gender Lens can be only one of them, or it can be multiple tools, multiple instruments, multiple considerations, and possibly, ideally, all of them. Thank you. Next slide. Why invest with a gender lens, right? This is a question that is still asked today, just like we were asking, I want to say 20 years ago, why invest sustainably, and why we were asking maybe a dozen years ago, why invest with impact, right? We still have to build a business case today, and the reason is both a moral and a business one. On the moral side, of course, we want to reduce poverty, and women are among the most the largest share of the poor. But we have a business argument as well, and really the Gender Lens initiative for Switzerland, we want to predicate most of our activities on the business case, meaning that if we were to achieve gender equality, it would add 26% to the global GDP, right? In this case, the forecast is for 2025, but now we know that it's going to take a bit longer than that to achieve. We also know that female entrepreneurs tend to generate more revenues than their male counterparts. This is again from multiple sources across multiple years and multiple markets. And we have evidence from McKinsey, from the OECD, from the Boston Consulting Group, that either financial institutions or fund managers or even companies that have a gender-balanced leadership, meaning that you have at least 1/3 of women in your board and in your senior management and in your investment committees, have a 25% better chance to achieve greater profits than companies that are not gender balanced. They are also more innovative, and they are more cost effective in their innovations, meaning that every innovation that they make is commercialized and contributes to the bottom line faster, right? This is undisputed statistical evidence from leading sources of industry. Next slide, please. So what's the market today, from an investor perspective or financial industry perspective? Well, it's been growing rapidly, but it's only been growing for the last 5 years or so. As of 2019, there were around 200 funds deploying about $10 billion of capital with a gender lens. And 28% of the companies surveyed by the UN have targets and goals related to women's empowerment. But of course, there's still a lack of reporting, a lack of transparency, and a lack of coherence from one report to the next, right? Because we're still defining industry standards in many ways. I think the bottom line here is that gender lens investing is here to stay. Like sustainable finance and like impact investing before it, it will continue to grow as a share of global allocations, and it will continue to generate an increasing range of opportunities for investors and for a transition to a sustainable economy. I'd also like to point out that it makes sense for us to draw on 50% of the population to increase the talent pool for our institutions and for the companies in our portfolios. So the first step that one can take is to address the hiring bias, right? Many institutions don't realize that they have a hiring bias against women, and if they address that, that immediately translates into a bottom line advantage by having better talent in your organization. Next, please. In terms of status quo, again, here some more statistics. I think in the interest of time, I won't spend too much here, but basically what it says is that there is an unequal set of opportunities for women today as financial managers, as entrepreneurs. That inequality is more pronounced if you're not only a woman, but also part of a minority segment of the population. And we found that those who invest, the pioneers who invest in women-run businesses, in women-owned businesses, and in minority businesses are doing very well, right? They are outperforming the mainstream of their industry performance average. Next. So that was it. I think we could speak for a week about the range of inequality and the range of opportunities in gender lens. But without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Jessica Espinoza from the German Development Agency to speak to us about perhaps just 1 minute, Jessica, on your journey, your personal journey and your current role, and then about the 2X challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and hello, everybody. So as Tim mentioned, I'm a senior investment manager and also the gender lead at DG, which is the German Development Finance Institution focusing on private sector investments in emerging markets. And DG is part of the KfW group, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, so the German Development Bank. And I'm also the chair of the 2X Challenge, and I'll tell you more about the 2X Challenge in a second on the next slide. We can go straight to the next one. The 2X Challenge, and I think many in the audience may be familiar with the initiative, was launched at the G7 summit in 2018 as an initiative by initially the development finance institutions of the G7 countries to commit and mobilize more capital with an explicit gender lens. As Tim mentioned, although I think we have all long recognized the importance of gender equality and SDG 5, not only as a goal in and of itself, but also to achieve all of the other SDGs. We've seen over decades that there has been very little capital that has actually been invested into SDG 5. And we wanted to start this initiative to really crowd in the private sector and to show how the private sector can promote SDG 5 with a very concrete investment practice and to mobilize more capital towards that objective. And so since its launch, the initial target was to collectively invest at least 3 billion until the end of 2020. We soon brought on board other DFIs, then also MDBs, and have since overachieved our target. This is an initial kind of progress report that you can see here. It's still as of December 2019, and that's because we're planning a big announcement at the G7 summit in June. So we look forward to announcing our final numbers, but it has been a big success. And it has quickly become the 2X investment framework in industry standard. So if we go to the next slide, and I'd really like to present or focus my presentation on the 2X criteria. At the time, there was usually, or like more this notion that if you invest with a gender lens, you look at women-owned and led businesses. And of course, that's a very important part of it. But as Tim has pointed out, there are a lot of opportunities along the entire value chain. So when we developed the 2X criteria and engaged with the spectrum of industry players on how the private sector can actually invest with a gender lens, we came up with 4 key criteria that you can see on this slide. The first one is entrepreneurship, so looking at businesses that are owned by women, so women's ownership. Also businesses founded by a woman, where the woman still has an active role. The second criterion looks at leadership, so the share of women in senior management, on the board, and the investment committee, where applicable. The third criterion looks at employment opportunities, and we know that women are often, especially in emerging markets, but I think it also holds true for Europe and the US, they are often concentrated in jobs that are not as well paid, that are more informal. And so here we have a strong factor of quality employment as well. And we also look at the gender gaps in terms of occupation and sector. So it's really looking at employment opportunities holistically. And then the fourth criterion, which is called consumption, that looks at products and services that specifically benefit women and girls, so that are designed with a gender lens. And here, just on a side note, in case you're interested to dive a little bit deeper into the need for gender smart products and services, there's this really fascinating book called Invisible Women that shows kind of the detrimental consequences of what happens when you design products and you take an average man as the kind of the prototype. And then the fifth criterion, that is when investing in financial intermediaries like financial institutions or private equity funds or debt funds. And then also looking at criteria 1 to 4, both at the level of the institution itself, as well as in its investment strategy and at the portfolio level. So that in a nutshell, these are the criteria and the opportunities we see along the value chain. We have since harmonized these criteria with leading industry standards like the IRIS Plus standard for impact management and measurement. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with IRIS Plus. It's part of the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. It's their standard. And we've also harmonized the metrics, the IRIS Plus metrics that are matched against the 2X criteria with the broader HIPSO efforts and other industry harmonization efforts. And as a result, the 2X criteria and the underlying impact metrics are today not only used by the members of the 2X challenge, but also by the full spectrum of investors from like really across the risk return spectrum, and also by private companies. There's also, this is perhaps something that is not as well known on our website. You can also find guidance to the criteria. So there is actually also some very practical underlying guidance of how to make sure that you're not only looking at the opportunities, but that you're also ensuring that the investment is not causing any harm with a gender lens, so kind of the ESG perspective. And there are good practice examples of how to ensure that a company does not only kind of by accident tick the box on the criteria, but that there is intentionality behind it and that the story as a whole is also convincing. If we go to the next slide, I think my time is almost up. I just wanted to also point out quickly that we have a number of resources available and are actively engaging with the whole spectrum of players in the industry to promote best practice and to further mobilize capital towards SDG 5. And for example, we've offered guidance on COVID response, how to make that gender smart. As Tim pointed out, COVID has really rolled back progress made towards gender equality over many years, and it's really at unprecedented speed that we see so much of the progress kind of being rolled back. So we're constantly offering new thought leadership and guidance on how to make sure that our COVID response and also recovery efforts have a strong gender lens. And yeah, I think with that, back to you, Tim. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jessica. We'll dive straight into the next speaker, who's Christine Rhodey from the Alpha Mooney Foundation in Washington, D.C. Christine, the floor is yours. If you can just tell us a couple words about you and then your angle on gender lens, please. Thank you.
Tim, I think Emmeline might be before me.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, sorry, Emmeline, the floor is yours to hear about Calvert Impact. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
No problem. Hi, I'm Emmeline. I'm the General Counsel at Calvert Impact Capital. We are a private impact investor, and we've been doing gender lens investing for about a decade now. One of the things that we have seen is that people are really curious, as are we, about how you incorporate gender lens specifically into your legal documentation. The majority of our investments are in debt instruments, so in loans, and there has just been this real hunger to understand how do you incorporate these items into your loan documents. Now you have these great ideas, do you actually have mechanics to enforce these? And so we actually worked with the NYU Law School last year, so New York University Law School, and they did a very extensive survey of 20 different impact investors. They're listed in the annex to this report, which is on our website. I won't go over them now. Some of them are on this call today, but they did very in-depth interviews, several hours with different people, with AUM of as small as $20 million US to, for some of the DFIs, over $3 billion of AUM. And this was a great mechanic because it allowed folks to anonymously, essentially, provide information to NYU, who was then able to aggregate this and work with Calvert to publish this. So some really interesting findings came out from this. So the first is when we're looking at a loan agreement, what the most common things that end up in a loan agreement are a directed use of proceeds, so that this investment must be directed to, for example, women-owned or led businesses, or it might be used in a business that serves largely women clients, products designed for women and girls. These are very common provisions. A second very common provision that we found that just about, I think, every single gender lens investor incorporated was required reporting metrics. So you've heard others talk about Iris Plus. That's probably one of the most common metrics that we found that the respondents used. And being able to measure whether or not there was gender was extremely important. What I think was equally interesting in the findings was what you didn't see in loan agreements and why you didn't see them. And specifically, areas that we looked into were representations and warranties, whether or not there were representations and warranties about gender within the investment. And you didn't tend to see these. Additionally, you didn't tend to see covenants. Were there kind of a minimum number of women on the board or a minimum number of women served? And as we dug into it, and I like that it was a survey and there were discussions, because what came out was much more nuanced, that there was a lot of concern that kind of counting women can be too narrow, right? So if you're saying literally we just want X percentage of women served, you end up in this dynamic where you might be checking the box, and that's not really kind of gender lens and kind of what we're kind of the more expansive idea of gender lens. And also kind of, working with individual borrowers, it's extremely contextualized. Depending on which market you work in, you might unintentionally exclude certain borrowers or unintentionally check the gender lens box. And so people are resistant in adding covenants. Additionally, people are actually very resistant in adding, so we had talked, are people considering gender lens in terms of disbursement mechanics? So in order to, access certain amounts of funds, do you have to hit certain gender metrics? And again, there was a lot of discussion about unintended consequences of doing this. So the majority of the respondents said that they actually don't incorporate these into their loan documents because it may have unintended consequences. And one of the places that we looked at that was, what is the impact of failing to meet some of these requirements that you might put in your debt documents? And, that impact could be very, very severe. So it could be, stopping funding under your loan agreement, but more importantly, it could be a cross default for this particular borrower across their other loan agreements, which would be potentially devastating for their business. It would be extremely harmful for the relationship that these gender impact investors have with this borrower. So one of the things that came out was that the relationship that's built in the discussions that happen between the impact investor and the ultimate borrower are extremely important. So the next slide here. So if you don't put them in your loan agreements, the follow-up question was, well, where do you put them? How do you embed gender into your legal documents? So we came up with respondents came up with 3 kind of buckets of where gender kind of comes in outside of the 4 corners of your loan document. So the first is in a side letter. Once you take it out of the loan agreement, you can avoid things like automatic cross defaults. So you may enter into a legally binding side letter that has a separate contractual agreement. You can use language like we use best efforts to incorporate different gender metrics, or you may have terms that are we'll check in, we'll have discussions on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis where we'll review. And the second is kind of, relationship building. So we found, which was very interesting, in that short-term loans tended not to have as many gender metrics. And the reason for that is because if you have a short-term loan, you're probably up for renewal. So the impact of renewing that investment in the borrower or kind of additional financing was enough of an incentive that if you communicated to the borrower that gender lens was very important to you, even without a hard kind of covenant in the loan document, you actually got fairly good compliance with borrowers. Where you saw gender covenants more kind of embedded into the loan agreements were in longer term agreements, where the investor thought that they needed the ability to kind of exit or the ability to have kind of a hammer against the borrower in case they didn't meet the gender lens perspective and kind of the very gender lens goals that you might have in mind. And the third was that we also saw a number of our respondents engage in kind of non-binding MOUs. So just essentially a memorandum of understanding. This kind of eases the compliance pressure on the portfolio borrower. It is less stressful on the relationship, and it is helpful in kind of growing, again, kind of the relationship that the impact investors have with the ultimate borrowers. So the next slide. And one of the reasons, again, that we talked about this was, I think I think what's very interesting that came out of the survey was that everyone was extremely conscientious of unintended consequences. So there's an aversion to tying gender impact-driven provisions to events of default. There may be lots of different reasons that the borrower hasn't met this particular metric. It should be a goal and not something that leads them into an event of default. The second was that the investors actually prioritized flexibility. They wanted a lot of flexibility in their investments. And they didn't want to have to call an event of default. And one of the ways that they did this was that, they could have an exit mechanic. And, again, this is driven by, in part, pushback from the borrowers, especially for the newer borrowers. When you're imposing a gender lens on a newer borrower, there is a lot of hesitancy to make sure that this doesn't jeopardize their other financing arrangements. There's also just a lot of nuance in trying to figure out, what are the on-the-ground considerations for our borrower, and an unwillingness to jeopardize relationships with a committed borrower that you've worked, over time to build. One of the things I do want to point folks to, which are, is that there are actually a couple of guides at the very back of this report, which I think are incredibly helpful. So the first is I point you to Appendix B, in which we actually have walked through different provisions of the loan agreement. And how you can think about embedding gender into those provisions and considerations that you might have. And you can kind of mirror that with what others are doing to give you an idea of what might be market and what might not be market. And then Appendix C, I think, is really interesting. It's a flow chart, and it's really aimed at kind of the business and the diligence team, where it talks you through, what types of questions you might want to be asking internally. What your level of comfort in terms of control over the borrowing relationship is, and kind of, what your alternatives are. You can put them in the loan document, you can put them in the diligence questions, you can put them in a legally binding side letter, a non-legally binding side letter, but it walks you through all the different options that people are considering. Our takeaway from the survey was that it was extremely interesting to see what people are doing and what people are not doing. And I think it was really fascinating to be able to see that it's a field that's developing, everyone is always really interested in, what are the standards? What is market? What we discovered is market is still evolving. But one of the things that we think can really push this field forward is increased transparency. So we are hopeful that there will be a second step to this project in which we might publish specific examples of people's loan agreements, again on an anonymized basis. But I think increased transparency of what other people have been thinking about and what the field has been doing, I think would be really great.
That's great. Thank you.
I encourage everyone, if you're interested in
it.
downloading the report.
Thank you very much. If I can just ask the next speakers to try to stick to the 5 minutes so that we have time for a Q&A with the audience at the end. Christine, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Christine Rhodey, and I work with Alpha-Mundi. For those of you who aren't familiar with Alpha-Mundi, we have a hybrid structure with a Swiss for-profit impact investing advisory arm based out of Geneva that provides investments to small and medium enterprises with a gender lens in Latin America and East Africa. And we have a nonprofit sister organization, the Foundation, which is where I am seated. And the Foundation supports the impact measurement and management efforts and gender lens investing efforts of our for-profit sister organization. And today I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing impact measurement with a gender lens, because I think what we measure matters, right? So if we can go to the next slide really quickly. And so very briefly, I want to talk through some of the approaches and tools and frameworks that we're using to measure our impact at Alpha-Mundi very briefly. And so I think, taking a step back and thinking about the framing that Tim provided earlier on in the session, when we look at the broader impact investing ecosystem, I think a lot of the success on gender lens investing is predicated on how well fund managers are working with SMEs to promote gender equity across the business. And of course, a lot of the success is predicated and measured based on how we're tracking this impact, right? So very briefly, a few things that we're doing at Alpha-Mundi, and I'll start on the left-hand side of the slide. And maybe before going through this, I'll just briefly talk about our approach. And Jessica mentioned this in her part of the presentation, but we are trying to promote gender equity as a core business principle across all of our investees, right? And this is agnostic of product and service orientation or leadership composition. And so we're doing this in a few ways, but one of our major approaches right now is to work with companies in our portfolio over a 12 to 24 month period in partnership with organizations like Value for Women to do what we like to term business first, gender smart technical assistance interventions. So this is working hand in hand with our portfolio companies to identify business challenges and pilot and test solutions to those challenges with a gender lens. And so in terms of the data that we're collecting across the portfolio at the SME or investee level, of course, we're collecting both qualitative and quantitative data coming out of these business first gender smart TA interventions with companies in our portfolio. So we have 10 of these projects ongoing right now. Additionally, we've officially incorporated gender as a component of the due diligence process. So we have adapted a tool that was co-created by Acumen in their International Center for Research on Women. So we do a diagnostic assessment that evaluates to what extent a business is incorporating gender across 5 dimensions of their operations. And then, of course, as we're structuring loan agreements with portfolio companies, we identify IRIS Plus related metrics, which I know Jessica mentioned earlier on in her presentation as well, to help us align on output level metrics that we will track and report on and aggregate on a quarterly basis. So this is really kind of some of the data that we're tracking at the SME level. Then if you take a step up and look at the fund or portfolio level, we use the 2X criteria that Jessica elaborated on. Alpha-Mundi, adheres to all 4 of the kind of 2X criteria, which is fantastic. We also aggregate and report on data at an SDG level. Specifically, we track and report on SDGs 1, of course, 5, 7, 8, and 12. Alpha-Mundi is also one of the founding signatories to the Principles for Impact Measurement and Management, which means that we issue a disclosure statement annually that really is documenting the process for how we measure and manage impact. And then we also go through a biennial, so that's every other year, verification process by an independent third party that verifies that we're practicing what we preach when it comes to impact measurement and management. And then finally, I'd like to highlight our flagship field building effort related to gender lens investing, which is called G-Search. So G-Search is a consortium of 6 like-minded impact investors that Alpha Mindy is leading, that are taking a similar approach where we're providing this targeted business-first, gender-smart TA to a subset of our portfolio. So of the 6 impact investors that make up this consortium, we have 30 participating SMEs in emerging markets and an amazing opportunity to conduct some research to hopefully support our hypothesis that companies that do this type of work outperform their peers that don't when it comes to business and social financial performance. And so G-Search launched our first learning product earlier this year. So if you're an impact investor or an actor that's interested in moving from the why of gender lens investing to the how, I will drop that in the chat box. It's very easy to read. It's only 7 pages, and it has a great user guide of how each of these 6 investors are investing with a gender lens and some of the tested approaches, tools, and frameworks that they're using. And so very briefly, because I know I'm running on time, if we can go to the next slide, and I just want to highlight some of the key, perhaps I should reframe these from challenges and gaps to maybe opportunities for improvement and advancement in the GLI space.
1 minute, Chris, 1 minute.
Thank you, Tim. Very briefly, and again, what we track and measure matters. So I think, we've seen a lot of output level or proxy data that's self-reported, and there's a need to move beyond output to more outcome level data, and outcome level data, especially at the client or beneficiary level, along with the employee level as well. I think there's also, taking a step back in the GLI space, it's been fantastic that we've seen a tremendous uptick in approaches, tools, and frameworks, but a lot of times that can mean that it's a crowded space and it's difficult to know where to get started. And of course, there are aggregation and analysis challenges due to, if you saw on the previous slide, just the different types of data and the frequency of collection, outcome versus output level data. So there's challenges here from an aggregation perspective. And one final point I'll make here, I think, we talk a lot about employee level data, beneficiary and client level data, but I think there's a big opportunity to look at how we're changing organizational culture and perceptions around gender equality as well, both at the SME level and at the fund manager level. And this is a component of the research that we're conducting on G-Search, and I would encourage others to take a look at how we're shifting minds and perceptions around gender equality, in addition to some of the outputs and outcomes that we're tracking there. But I will pause there. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Chris. So our next speaker is David Ozaki. David, please go ahead. And again, 5 minutes tight, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and hi everybody. So my name is David Ozaki. I work as a sustainable finance lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is an international think tank headquartered in Canada, but I am based in Geneva, Switzerland. I cover a wide range of sustainable finance topics, including sustainable investing trends, ESG impact measurement, gender lens investing, of course, natural capital financing, and also providing second-party opinions for green and sustainability bond frameworks. So now I will give you a brief overview of the size of gender lens investing today. I will also show you some examples of gender products, and at the end of my intervention, I will just provide some suggestions for further innovation in the space. On the next slide, please. So it is quite difficult to really calculate the exact size of gender lens investing, as it is growing very fast, and sometimes it can be hard to access information, especially for private investment vehicles. Also, there is always the question of what criteria we use to define eligible instruments. So in other words, where to draw the line and what should be included. Having said that, according to GenderSmart, which is a global initiative for focus on scaling up gender smart capital, there is about $17 billion assets under management across various gender lens investment vehicles. Out of these 17 billion, $11 billion are in publicly traded instruments, such as mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, exchange-traded notes, and green bonds. On the other hand, there are about like 60 billion assets under management in private investment vehicles, such as private equity, private debt, and venture capital funds. There are actually hundreds of different instruments and investment vehicles applying gender lens. In private markets alone, there are about 220 funds. So we could easily say that we have quite a good coverage of gender lens investment products across the major asset classes, at least. But it's important to note, however, that these figures that I just showed you represent the named or gender-labeled funds and instruments, and exclude development finance institutions, private bonds, and microfinance. Of course, if you consider investment with any level of gender integration, this number would be significantly bigger. So, like according to the USC Foundation, assets under management taking gender lens into account has reached $1 trillion in 2020. On the next slide, I just want to show you quickly a figure from the Gender Smart Report that demonstrates very well the impressive growth of gender lens investing in recent years. This figure shows that in the last 4 years, gender lens investing has grown more than 7 times, and even compared to 2019, it has already doubled. So on the next slide, the question is, what is driving this growth? So it's clear that there's a strong momentum for integrating gender considerations in the financial products and services. So first, there is an increasing awareness about the benefits of gender diversity. Indeed, gender diversity has important socioeconomic as well as financial benefits, as Tim just mentioned in the introduction earlier. Also, we have better data and more transparency on corporate gender diversity nowadays. Although I have to say there's still room for improvement in that regard. But the availability of data makes the design of gender instruments and implementing gender-aligned investment mandates much easier. We have also seen a rapid growth in the gender sustainable investing in the general sustainable investing space. Assets under management with a sustainability mandate has reached $40 trillion last year. This has certainly had an impact on the popularity of gender lens investing as well. And last but not least, there's also a compelling business case for gender integration. There is evidence on the positive impact of gender diversity on corporate performance, and the numbers Tim shared in the introduction, so I will skip that for now. On the next slide, you have see some examples of financial products with gender lens, but I know Tim wants me probably to skip this slide because we have short of time, so I skip it. So let's go to the next slide, the last one. So what innovation, finally, I would like to just share a couple of thoughts on what product innovation I would like to see in the space in the coming years. First, it would be great to have more gender-aligned investment vehicles that direct capital towards companies who not only engage in positive workplace practices for their employees, but whose business models and activities support the advancement of women and equality for their customers and the communities in which they operate. Second, I would like to see gender performance being integrated more in debt governance, which was also covered earlier, like having more sustainably linked instruments on gender diversity. Also, gender investment vehicles should focus more on change, that is, channeling capital towards companies, projects involved in actively closing gender gaps, rather than simply rewarding current practices and performance. And finally, financing towards gender objectives could be scaled up significantly if gender considerations were integrated in all sustainable finance instruments and investment funds by default, irrespective of their thematic focus. So I don't have the time to unpackage this idea now, but I wrote an article on this topic that you can find on the IAS's website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for being so efficient, because I know it's so much content that we're trying to deliver to the audience. And here we can see the slide of the structure, the current structure of the Investment Solutions Committee of the GLIS, which will be screening funds and companies for gender lens feature and impact, and then showcasing these funds and companies in the months ahead. Our last but not least, we have Vanina Farber from the IMD to tell us about research. Vanina, please.
Thank you, Tim. I try to be brief because I think I have the honor to be one of the last speakers here after me, but to present the academic committee that we are building around the gender lens investing initiative here in Switzerland. So first, I want to introduce you a little bit to IMD, I would say, mission, and I think that why that really aligns to what we're doing and what we talk today, that is really to challenge what it is and inspire what it could be. I think Tim and Jessica presented at the beginning the dire statistics and how COVID has affected very disproportionately women and hit us back in many of the measurements. But I think that also something that I wanted to bring to the discussion on these negative statistics is that we don't only see losses of jobs, but now that we're starting to think about the recovery is also slower for women in business that are actually even much slower for Black and Hispanic women, for example, in the US, for minorities in different other countries. So what I wanted to bring on this idea is that it's not just about what hit us back, but also as we think about the recovery, we need to be proactive because things are not going to happen on their own. And something we do at the Lea Center for Social Innovation is precisely to think about that, is to reflect and convene people and create pedagogy and create research on how we can mobilize private capital to actually find solutions to social and environmental problems, and specifically with a gender lens in everything that we do. And I think many of the issues that were covered here are the kind of things that we work with. And we also make a focus, I think, on going beyond the counting game, and the ticking boxes, as Jessica and you mentioned, But at the same time, and I think it has been said, what is not measured is not managed. And I think we have to go beyond the numbers, but this overly cautious, sometimes worry about unintended consequences and about tightening up the incentives, it makes us not to change our business models or to have it in the sideways. So I think going beyond and thinking how we can change behavior and how can we change business models, how we include KPIs into procurement, into compensation, in attraction and retention of talent, and into the cost of capital, as it was mentioned here, is a must. And understand that what is market, but how we go beyond the market and set up practices based on evidence, I think is a key issue. And I think an academics alliance with the private sector and multi-stakeholder actually has this goal at the heart. You can see that sometimes the academic sector can lag behind practice, especially with the growth that you heard from David in sustainable finance. Sometimes a paper takes 2 years to get published. So what we're trying to do is to work on different fields, and at least on IMD on different venues. So from one side, yes, on one side, we are working on this alliance, and especially we're conducting now 3 surveys. And if you're more interested, we can talk about, but especially here in Switzerland. So there are 3 key areas. One is the availability of gender lens investment products. So to think about, and there were many that were mentioned here, but how widespread, how they're used in the Swiss market. Another is more about an institutional focus, looking inside at the financial industry and try to understand the gender balance inside of financial institutions. And I think last but not least, and I'm very interested on that one, on this one too, is of women as agents, if you want, as capital owners and investors in Switzerland. And on this side, we will try to create a benchmark, an initial analysis, and see the progression. And I clearly think that in Switzerland we have a very privileged ecosystem to make a change. 2 other initiatives that I'm working with, and especially in collaboration too. Sorry, I forgot to mention other members of this committee, because I don't want to leave anybody out. And we actually have two of the members also here, Tim Raju from Alphamundi and Jessica Espinoza from the University of Sion. We also have Rania Gibson from Geneva Finance Research Institute and Take One from the University of Zurich. And again, two other initiatives that we're working also in collaboration. One is with the Graduate Institute of Geneva, where we're working on an impact handbook, where a team will support us writing a chapter on gender lens investing. And we are doing an impact investing program with deep dives on different specific topics, and we will collaborate to create a gender lens investment for 2022. So really, to finish up, I think the academic sector can bring evidence-based solutions to speed and scale innovations that we need with gender lens.
That's great. Thank you, Vanina. One of the participants may have to go on mute. So we're at the end of the webinar. First of all, my thanks to all the speakers for their very valuable insights, and my apologies for rushing you through such a deep content. We will be able to organize deeper dive sessions in the months ahead on each of these perspectives. I'd like to conclude perhaps with the agenda of the GLIS for 2021 on the next slide. So we've heard about academic research, and we have heard about investment solutions committees. We've also heard about the industry benchmarks. In a nutshell, we're going to be organizing webinars because all this content has then to be shared with our partners, with the members of SFG. Our end game is to enable you to pick what you think makes sense for your organization and then make progress with the right experts and the right partners and the right tools on Gender Lens for your organization, right? So we have a series of Capital Connect webinars showcasing Gender Lens products across multiple regions of the world, organized by Gender Smart in April, May. We will have at the end of next month a similar event showcasing investment solutions for Swiss institutional investors. We are planning a webinar in June in collaboration with a number of UN agencies. And of course, our partners and our members are welcome to suggest webinar topics that we could organize either before the summer or in the fall. The last but very important points is building bridges that Sandrine mentioned in the beginning. Building bridges will take place at the end of the year, at the end of November. We want to encourage our partners at GLIS and the members of SFG to think about commitments you could make during that week of building bridges regarding gender lens investing over the course of 2022 and beyond. And in that spirit, we will be designing a menu of engagement options for all types of partners, because we are fortunate to have very different types of partners, from academia to banks to family offices to UN agencies. So that's something we want to work on. We are out of time. The last word goes to Sandrine. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending and for this very rich conversation. Sandrine, the floor is yours. And if Sandrine cannot find her mute button, I will thank all the participants for being with us and look forward to speaking again at the next webinar. Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.